I'm at my grandma's house in Kauai. So if the waves, you hear the waves, it's because um, we're next to the ocean. My grandpa's playing the guitar, or my uncle's playing the guitar downstairs. So if you hear that, that's what's going on. I found a nice quiet spot. Shut the doors. Hopefully we can continue. All right. So we left off talking about the quadrant. Here's a quadrant model. So, yeah. So I want to say just a few more stories in the Gospels. One of them was one of the Samaritan women. So there's a Samaritan woman. She goes to the well. It's late in the day. It's not common for a woman to go late in the day. It's common for the women to go to the wells and gather water, get whatever they need early in the morning. So the question is, why is this woman going when it's sunny, when it's not a common time to go? Apparently, I heard that when I went to a church, the pastor was saying that um, the women would go to these wells, and this would be a place where they would gossip, where they would talk. It's kind of like the mall back in the day, or not the mall, but I don't know, maybe Starbucks, I don't know, but where people would get together, they would talk, they would all go to the well in the morning, they would talk. But here this woman is by herself later in the day getting the water. Why is she by herself? Why is she doing this? Then Jesus comes up and then he tells her, so you're getting, I don't know exactly what he said, but he said something like, I'm just paraphrasing. He starts to talk to her, and then she says, I'm a Samaritan woman. Jews don't talk to Samaritans. Why are you talking to me? That it's against the rules. And then Jesus tells her something about, I don't know. He continues to talk to her, but then he ends up telling her. She asks him something about prayer, and then he tells her that the Samaritans, something about the Samaritans do not know um, what they're praying, what they're praying for, who they're praying to. He says the Jews know um, who they pray to. So once again, we see the Jews portrayed as entities. The Jews know, he says. And he says that the salvation comes from the Jews. So once again, it's funny when I hear the ideas of the church saying that Jesus somehow was against the Jews. Um, he says right there, the salvation comes from the Jews. And he says, he tells the woman that, okay, but so he tells her that, okay. But anyways, going back to what the woman was saying, when Jesus says something about her husband, and she says, I don't have, I don't have a husband, and Jesus was like, yeah, I know, you've had 5 husbands. So so now we're starting to see, okay, this is why she's at the well later in the day. This is what the pastor was saying when I went to the church. So the pastor was saying the reason why this woman, according to the story, is going to the well so late in the day is because she's had 5 husbands. She must be the topic of gossip. People must talk a lot about her. She's kind of an outsider, a pariah. Once again, she doesn't belong. And who does Jesus visit? Her. He doesn't go to the women in the morning and talk to all the women. He talks to this woman who is a pariah, kind of outside of the group. She's had 5 husbands. She probably, maybe she's a little bit wild. She's probably attractive. Maybe she's rich, but clearly she's not willing to settle down. She's not content. She's not second quadrant oriented. She seems to be more fourth quadrant oriented in this way. So Jesus talks to her. He tells her that he has water that is the living water, and after she drinks that, she'll never go thirsty. Now, I want to say that the living water is kind of a reference I heard to the Nile River of Egypt, but the living water, when any bubbling water was called the living water, but in Egypt they would call the Nile like the river of life, or the bubbling, or the living water, something like that. And the idea behind that was the Nile represented resurrection, because every once in a, every year the Nile would die, the river would kind of dry up, but then it would always come back, and then the fields would grow again, the crops would grow, and things would be good. But it always disappears but comes back, the constant ephemerality, the constant death and resurrection. But Jesus says, I have that living water. And then so she says, you've explained everything to me. And then she runs back to the Samaritan people, and she tells the Samaritans, hey, this guy, well, first off, she says, she says something about, she says something about Jesus, she says something about Jesus being the Messiah, I think, and then Jesus, I think, says something like, I am he. So then she runs back, she tells the people, hey, this guy, he told me everything. And the people come, and they once again, they start to believe in him. They want to kind of, they settle for the belief. And they're all really happy about Jesus being there, and they want him to stay, but Jesus doesn't want to stay. He continues to go on. But the idea is, once again, we have this woman who was kind of the outcast. She was not the one who wanted to settle down. She was not happy, content. Things weren't going great for her. She's had 5 husbands, and she was the one who Jesus visited. So then we're going to go to the next, to another story where the story with Mary putting perfume on Jesus's feet. So one thing I want to say is that some people say that Jesus, he didn't disobey any laws, so why is it that he died? Well, apparently, and you see it throughout the Gospels, Jesus kept on doing things like healing people and stuff like this on the Sabbath. And it was against the law to do any work on the Sabbath. And according to Leviticus, if you do any work on the Sabbath, it's punishable by death. Once again, you disobey, you get death. Disobedience, not behaving, knowledge, death. So Jesus would do this, do things on the Sabbath. This is punishable by death. So, but anyways, so he's with Mary and Martha represents more second quadrant. She's a behavior. She's in the kitchen and she's cooking, and she tells Mary, who's listening to Jesus, Mary, why don't you come and help me out in the kitchen? But then Jesus tells her, hey Martha, Mary has picked something greater. He said something like, I forget exactly what he said, but basically he said that, what Mary's doing is fine. She doesn't have to help you out in the kitchen. So Martha was trying to make herself feel better by being like, hey, I'm doing all this work. I'm superior. Why don't you help out, Mary? You are so lazy. But Jesus says, hey, leave her alone. She's in the 4th quadrant, right? She wants to know. She's seeking the truth. She doesn't need to be needed. She doesn't need to be working in the kitchen. All right. Then another part, Jesus is talking to the people, and then Mary dumps a whole thing of perfume on his feet, and then she wipes her hair on his feet. And then some of the disciples are saying, "What are you doing, Mary?" Because this is one thing you have to always notice, that there's contradictions, or things that seem like contradictions in the Bible. So right previous to this, Jesus says something about how you should give all, if you want to be perfect, give all your belongings to the poor. But so the disciples are saying, what are you doing? You could have given that perfume to the poor. You just wasted that. This worth a lot of money. But then Jesus says, hey, what she did was good. Now, what I want to say about this is the disciples were thinking in terms of, kind of a capitalistic mindset, a kind of saving mindset. Maybe you should just pour a little bit of the perfume on his feet, or maybe you should save this perfume, or you should ration it out a little bit. But Mary, she's more fourth quadrant oriented. She's being spontaneous. She's the spontaneous one. Remember, the fourth quadrant is more spontaneous. This one's more planning oriented and saving oriented and belonging and keeping it working and being useful. But this one is more spontaneous. You're not necessarily thinking before you do things. So she just dumps the whole thing on it. Spontaneous. She's not thinking about it. Now these guys are saying, hey, you should ration it out. You should, maybe you should pour a little bit on his feet. You should save some. But Jesus says, no, what she did was good. And he says that wherever the gospel is preached, what she did is going to be taught with it. So according to this, Jesus knew that according to this story, Jesus knew that the story would be taught throughout future generations. So then we have another example where Mary and Martha, once again, Mary's seen as more second quadrant, Martha's more second quadrant, Mary's more fourth quadrant. So Mary, or I think it was Mary's, maybe it was his brother, I forget, let's just say it was his brother Lazarus dies. And so Martha meets up with Jesus as he's walking to, go to meet them, because he was supposed to keep Lazarus from dying. And Martha says, oh man, Jesus, you just missed it. He's been dead for 4 days. Once again, he's been dead for 4 days, and it's not, he's not here with us anymore. And then Jesus says, I forget how it works exactly, but Jesus says something like, well, who do he asks him about who she thinks he is. That he says something about how he himself is the resurrection, and the life. And then she says that she believes this. She says that she believes this and that he can resurrect the life. Because the reason why she says this is because originally she says something like, well, we know that on the day of resurrection, the day of the resurrection, Lazarus will be raised again. But Jesus says, you don't believe that I can, that I am the resurrection? Jesus says, I myself am the resurrection. So then she says, oh, I believe you, Jesus. So she's seen as second quadrant. She believes him. And then Jesus, so then it says that she goes back to get to get Mary. And then as she's going back, Jesus just stays there. He's not hurrying. He doesn't really care anymore. He's just staying there. So we have her saying, oh yeah, I believe you. I believe that you are. She says, I believe that you are the Christ. And, she says this. He just stays there. He's not impressed, it seems. So then Mary comes up, and then Mary is crying. And she says, she's like, Jesus, how could you have let my brother die? And she's so upset. And she comes with other Jews too. And the Jews are weeping about what happened. And then Jesus is moved. And Jesus leaves from that spot, and he says, where is he? So once again, the woman was believing, and Jesus kind of stayed at the spot, whatever. Then Mary, the knower, she's not trying to be pious and deferential to Jesus. She cries and she says, what were you, you should have come earlier. And then Jesus says, okay, where is this guy? He's moved. And then Jesus starts to weep. And then he goes and then he raises Lazarus. Now this is what I'm going to say. Lazarus is raised, and then it says that the Jews started to believe in Jesus. Now, the people start to get, the priests start to get upset. And they say amongst each other, and this is what I'm going to explain, hopefully. So this is my thesis. But they say amongst each other, this Jesus guy, the people are starting to believe in him. If the people believe in him, we're going to be killed. So they say, it's better that we kill Jesus in order that the whole community will be saved. And then then some of the preachers are saying, no, well, this guy's a prophet. We shouldn't kill him. He's doing all these signs. We shouldn't kill this guy. But then one of the high priests says, don't you guys understand? He said that he had prophesied earlier that year that Jesus would die so that the Israel would be saved, and that the community that was spread throughout the world would be gathered once again. The community of the Jewish people. So he's saying that this is what he had prophesied, that Jesus would die so that the Jewish people would be saved. What does this mean? Well, we have to look at the context of the Bible. To understand the story of Jesus's crucifixion, this story, you have to understand the previous stories in the Bible, in the Old Testament. So, like I said, the historians say that they believe that the reason why Jesus was killed was because he was being seen by people as a messianic Jewish figure, someone who would break the Jews out of the control of the Romans and would bring about the messianic kingdom, that he would be the king of the Jews. And the priests knew that this was a dangerous thing because there's only one king, and that king is Caesar. So if they proclaim another king, then Caesar's going to send his armies, and if the people try to rebel, then Caesar's going to annihilate them. He's going to annihilate the Jewish people. So the Jewish people don't want to start too much trouble. An interesting fact is that the Romans let the Jewish people be on their own and worship their own God and not worship their gods, because they saw that the Jewish people were such an ancient people, and the Romans were impressed by antiquity. So they thought, this is an ancient people, they must have a really powerful God. And they thought, we'll just leave them alone. This is ancient people, they must have a powerful God, they must have a God that's protecting them. Let's just leave them alone. They were impressed by antiquity. So the Romans are kind of portrayed as second quadrant oriented. So this is what historians say, and so this is an interesting fact too. Pontius Pilate, according to historians, was a very brutal, I guess his name was a pontificate. I don't know, but he was a brutal leader. And remember, he was the guy who ended up having Jesus crucified. Well, apparently he would have a lot of people crucified, and he was a very bloody leader. And so when Jesus is crucified, he's saying, Pontius Pilate says, the blood of Jesus is rinsed off my hands, and he washes his hands. Apparently, people reading the Gospels who knew Pontius Pilate, or not reading the Gospels, but people who heard this story, knew that this was satirical. He had so much blood on his hands, there's no way that Pontius Pilate was free from the blood on his hands. And what Pontius Pilate would say to the Jews before he crucified them, he was egging them on. He was saying, hey Jews, who should I let go? Barbarous, the thief, or Jesus, the king of the Jews? And he would say the king of the Jews every time he said this. And the Jews would say, let Barabbas go, let Barabbas go. But then Pontius Pilate would say again, but should I let Barabbas go, or the king of the Jews? So the idea is, the Jews know that there's one king, that is Caesar, and if they proclaim another king, then this is going to be dangerous for them. They're going to be killed. So Pontius Pilate knows this too, so he's trying to egg them on, so he's trying to blame the Jews for saying, no, kill him. But the Jews are just trying to say, hey, we realize that if we have a king, we're all going to be killed. If we try to rebel, we're going to be killed. If we proclaim a new king, then the Romans say that they're impressed by the Jews, their antiquity, but they're not going to let them have a king to separate completely from the Roman Empire. Now, this is my thesis, and I think that this is true, and it can be shown throughout the whole Bible, that Jesus was the story of the Gospels was the greatest thing that could have happened to the Jewish people, because it is because of the fact that the world was converted, most of the world was converted to Christianity, Islam, and other religions that are Abrahamic religions that believe in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the forefathers, the patriarchs of the Jews. It is because of this that the Jews lived throughout history and were not annihilated and were not killed. If you look through history, yes, there was a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment by Christians and Muslims, but also the Christians and Muslims protected the Jews, and even the American president, fought for the Jews to stay in Israel, even though he was anti-Jewish in ways. He didn't like Jews too much, but he wanted the Jews to be in Israel because he thought that would fulfill Jesus's prophecies, or the prophecy of Jesus' second coming, because Jesus said that he would not come until the Jews are in Israel. So, the fact that the world was converted to Christianity, Islam, yes, there is Buddhism and there is Hinduism, but the fact that the world was converted to, but like I said, Buddhism and Hinduism, they accept the Jewish people. They're cool with it. But the Jews would have probably been destroyed or they definitely would not be in Israel if most of the world wasn't converted to Christianity and Islam. You say, okay, that makes sense, but so what? And actually, a lot of people are going to say, well, we don't really believe you. But I have to talk about this. I have to explain why it is that Jesus, the story of Jesus' crucifixion, was supposed to be something that saved the Jews, and what that high priest was describing when he said that Jesus must die so that the Jewish people could later be gathered and the Jewish people can be saved. So let's look all the way back to the Old Testament. Let's look at the story of Joseph. Joseph had 12 brothers, like Jesus' 12 disciples. Similar names too. Joseph told his brothers that one day he would rule over them, kind of, that they would all bow down to him. And he also told his father and mother that. So the brothers get jealous, and Judah, then they tried it, they want to kill him, but then Judah says, hey, you know what? Let's not kill him, let's just sell him as a slave. So Judah actually saves him. And then the brothers like, that's a good idea, let's do that. So they pretend to kill Joseph by taking his clothes and ripping it. They rip his garments. Same thing happened with Jesus later. They ended up ripping his garments, but that's another story. So they rip Joseph's garments. They dip it in goat's blood. The goat represents the sacrifice, I guess. But so they dip his clothes in goat's blood, and then Judah sells the Joseph to some Egyptians for, I think it was 20 shekels, kind of like Judas sold Jesus to the Romans for 30 shekels. So then the brothers go back to their dad, and they show him the bloody garments, and then the dad rips his clothes and he says, my son, he's dead. He's lost his son. The father lost his son. Remember, Jesus' father, he claimed was God, and Jesus also died. So the father of Joseph, who was Jacob, the father of these 12 sons, Jacob's also, his name was changed to Israel. That's another story. But once again, with that story too, Israel, Jacob was up against the wall. He did not belong. His brother wanted to kill him, and this is when he wrestled with the angel. It was when he was against the wall, when things were not going good for him. He left his community. He went to the other side of the river. He was by himself. He was not in this second quadrant. Things were difficult, and that's when he wrestled with the angel, and that's when his name was changed to Israel. But back to the story. So Joseph is sold to Egypt, and in Egypt, he's accused by I think it was the Pharaoh's wife, of molesting her, even though he didn't do it. This is a common thing that happens too. In these stories, he's accused for something that he didn't do. He gets in trouble and then he's put to jail. But then he interprets the Pharaoh's dreams. It's a long story, and more can be explained. But he interprets the Pharaoh's dreams. The Pharaoh ends up liking this Joseph guy a lot. He makes Joseph second in command to him. So Joseph is the most powerful person in the Egyptian empire. So then there's a famine, and this is what Joseph predicted in his dreams, and he told the Pharaoh guy, actually this wasn't the Pharaoh, I made a mistake, this is just a big leader, an Egyptian leader. So he tells this Egyptian leader, maybe it was a Pharaoh, I forget, but I think it was just an Egyptian leader. He tells the Egyptian leader, hey, you guys should, get some surplus food so that you aren't, so that you can survive this famine. So the Pharaoh, or so this Egyptian leader says, that's a good idea. They do that, and then they end up being able to survive this famine. Well, because there's a famine, Joseph's family, Jacob and his sons, are dying. So they have to go to Egypt to ask for food. His sons go to Egypt to ask for food. And then they run into Joseph, the second in command. One of the highest positions, he has one of the highest positions in Egypt. And then Joseph, he kind of messes with them a little bit. But long story short, he ends up bringing the 12 sons to Egypt, and he saves them. And he saves the Jewish people. Because these sons were the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and these are the Jewish people. So Judah, in sacrificing Joseph, or in selling Joseph to the Egyptians, and having him go to the Egyptians, it seemed like it was a bad thing, but it ended up actually saving the family, and it saved the Jewish people. And then when Jacob comes back, comes to see Joseph, it's almost like Joseph was reborn. There was a death and a resurrection. He thought that his son was dead, but he was actually alive. So it's the same pattern, the same type of story as we see with Jesus. Okay, let's go to a different story. Go back to Samson. So Samson was a Nazirite. He was a Nazirite. This just means that he does not eat grapes, and he does not shave his head. I can explain what the significance of all this is, hopefully later. But so he's born. It's kind of a miraculous birth. His mother is not supposed to have another child, but somehow there's a miraculous birth, kind of like in the story of Jesus. And he ends up living with the Philistines. Once again, remember I said that a lot of these people who were big prophets or important for the Israelite community did not grow up within the Israelite community. They grew up outside of it. So he kind of lives with the Philistines. And this isn't good because he's a Nazarite. He's supposed to live with the Jewish people, but he lives with the Philistines. Interestingly, when he goes to live with the Philistines, he meets up with a lion, and then he kills the lion. And then he lives with the Philistines. When he comes back from living with the Philistines, there's honey within the lion. The honey represents wisdom, and wisdom and knowledge. So remember, he left the Israelite community. That is the second quadrant. community is a second quadrant. Living within the safety net is a second quadrant. He goes to live with the Philistines. He's in the uncomfortable zone, the fourth quadrant. He's out of his comfort zone. He's not living in this safety net. What happens out of this is you gain knowledge. So this is represented by when he comes back and there's the honey. He had, living outside of his comfort zone in difficult circumstances. He comes back out of the Philistines, out of his interaction with the Philistines with knowledge and wisdom, represented by the honey. We see this in other stories. So, for instance, there's this one guy, Jonathan. I think he was a son of Saul, but I don't remember exactly. But there was a command not to leave this certain boundary area, and he left the boundary area and he killed some Philistines or whatever, or some Gentile group. So then he comes back out of it, and this was against the rules, and he ends up eating some honey that was on the ground, and he was not supposed to eat the honey. So we see the same type of story, and then he was supposed to be killed. Remember, knowledge is death. He broke out of the community. This is knowledge. He disobeyed, and then he eats the honey. It's kind of like eating the fruit. So he eats the honey, and he's supposed to be killed, but he ends up not being killed, because that's also a common theme. They're supposed to be killed, but they're not killed, because it was actually good what he did. But anyways, back to Samson. So Samson, he leaves the community, he comes back, but then he goes back to he comes back, and then what ends up happening is the Philistines made him angry, because the Philistines lied to him, and they took his possessions. They went back on a promise. It's a long story, but Samson is pissed, and Samson says, "You know what? I'm going to kill the Philistines." So Samson starts to kill the Philistines, and then the Philistines start to get really upset. Samson does things like he gets foxes and he ties their tails together and he lights them on fire and he puts them into the Philistine fields. And he does other things where he gets a donkey's jaw and he just starts to tear apart Philistines. So the Philistines are saying, "You know what? We got to kill this guy and we got to kill the Jews." So then the Jews go to Samson. They say, "Samson, what are you doing, man? You're gonna destroy our community. The Philistines are gonna kill us because of you." So Samson ends up saying, "You know what? That's fine. So long as you guys don't kill me, I'm cool. Give me to the Philistines. Let them kill me." So they say, "Okay, we promise." They give him to the Philistines, and then he ends up being killed. But when he dies, so what they do is they poke out his eyes, and they had cut. I'm gonna get to this more later, but they had cut off his hair, and he lost his strength when his hair was cut off. That's how they actually caught him in the first place, was they cut off his hair. But the Philistines cut out his eyes, but then his hair grew, and they made him dance for him. Then his hair grows back, and then he breaks down the walls, and then all the Philistines are killed. And it says that more Philistines were killed in his death than in his life. And then it says, then they knew that the Lord was with them. The Jews knew the Lord was with them. So once again, knowing after the death. But one thing I want to say too is, a part of the story, I forgot to say how Samson was caught in the first place, was they had to cut off his hair, but there was 4 things that happened. Delilah was a Philistine woman that Samson was, hooking up with. And Delilah, he was hanging out with Delilah. So once again, he's not a second quadrant guy. He's hanging out with the foreign woman, doing stuff with her. He's fourth quadrant. He's not following the rules. Second quadrant likes to follow the rules. The fourth quadrant doesn't follow rules. He's broken out of the community, the safety net. So, but anyways, there's 4 things that happen. So Delilah says first, what's the source of your strength? So she wants to catch him, and he says, and he says something, and then the question is, did he even know the source of his strength? Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he thought it was this. So she tries to, he said something like, it's my, I'm just making this up. I forget what it was, but let's just say he said, it's my clothes, or it's my shoes. And then she took off his shoes. This didn't happen, but I forget exactly what happened, but she took off his shoes. It didn't work. they tried to catch him, but then he ended up killing all the people who tried to catch him. So then she tries another one. The second time it didn't work. The third time it didn't work. Then the fourth time he says, "It's my hair." So once again we see the quadrant. The fourth time it worked, and they end up catching him. So, like I said, the Jews brought him over to the Philistines because they knew that if they didn't, then the Philistines were going to kill him and kill the Jews with him. So they needed to do this in order to appease the Philistines. And Samson ends up killing more Philistines in his death than when he lived. So once again, it doesn't seem like, you know, you have to remember that the Old Testament is a book that is definitely does not. I'm not gonna say it, but yeah, the Philistines were not treated very well. There's a lot of cases where Gentiles in the Bible are not treated well. So that happened. And so what I'm going to get at is these stories illustrate, and then the Jewish people were saved because of that. Now here's another example. So Jonah, same type of story. Jonah's told by God, though, this time. Jonah's told by God that you should convert the Ninevites to your religion. Jonah was a Jew. And Jonah says, "No, I don't want to do that." And then once again, you see the God does not choose the guy who is saying, "Oh yes, I will do that. I will do whatever you say. I will behave." Jonah's like, "No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to convert the Ninevites." So then Jonah runs away. But then, he goes on a boat, and then this is a fascinating thing. He's on the boat and he's with these other guys, and there's a storm and they're all going to die. And then they're saying, who on this boat is responsible for this storm? And of course it's Jonah, because God is mad at Jonah for running away. And Jonah says, remember the fourth quadrant, he's not afraid to die. He says, "You know what? Throw me overboard. I'm the reason. I will die for you guys." And then he ends up being thrown overboard, and then a fish eats him. So this is metaphorical. You could see it as literal if you want, but it's metaphorical of going through hardships. He's swallowed by the fish, but then he comes out, and after this he understands. He has knowledge. He has wisdom. He's like, "You know what? Fine. I'm going to try to convert the Ninevites like God told me to do it." So he goes and he converts. He goes to convert the Ninevites, and to his surprise, the Ninevites are saying, "Yeah, everything you say is true. We believe you. We'll behave according to you." Now, what you have to know about the Ninevites is they were seen as a very brutal people. They were very dangerous people to the Israelites. So I heard someone say that, they're like basically they're just a dangerous group of people for the Israelites, and so it was dangerous for Jonah to go there in the first place. But to his surprise, they're all like, "Oh yeah, we believe everything you're saying." So it seems like they're more second quadrant oriented. Remember I said that the Jews in the Bible are portrayed often as more NT oriented, knowing, and the Gentiles are portrayed more as second quadrant oriented. So what happens is Jonah says, "Yeah, you know what? Jonah converts the Gentiles and converts the Ninevites. And Jonah's so upset about this. And he's saying, "God, just kill me now." Once again, he's willing to die. The fourth quadrant oriented. He just God. Moses does this. A lot of the Israelites do this throughout the story. Throughout the whole Bible story. So Jonah says, just kill me now, God," because he's so upset. He's thinking these guys are just accepting it, maybe, but they don't really know. They're not worth being converted over. So he's saying, "God, just kill me." He's so upset. And then God says to him, Jonah, trust me. I have a, he doesn't say this, I'm paraphrasing, but God has a plan. So he says, Jonah, there's a lot of them and there's also a lot of cattle that they have. So it's interesting. He puts them and cattle in the same sentence. It's almost like he's kind of equating them with cattle. It doesn't seem like a very wonderful thing that he says. And then he says, just trust me. He doesn't say this, but he says, he just ends it with that. And he also does a sign for Jonah that everything is okay by making a plant grow over Jonah and giving him shelter. So this is representing that, out of doing this, you are going to be protected. So the way that I see this is, yes, it is a good thing that the Ninevites were converted, because what's the best way to keep a group that's dangerous to you from not killing you? You convert them to your religion so they belong with you. And this is what ended up happening. But you think, oh yeah, well, Ryan, you're stretching it. Well, then look later. A few chapters later, and a few books later, what happens? There's a chapter about the Ninevites being destroyed. The whole Ninevite community was killed by God. So they were converted over, but they ended up just being killed. Now you're saying, but how does this relate to Jesus? So I was telling you that, Joseph, his death, it ended up saving the Jewish people. Samson, his death, it ended up saving the Jewish people, and Samson willingly did this. And I'm going to get to even the fact that Jesus willingly did this, and there's a lot of evidence that happened, that Jesus wanted to be crucified, and then we see the fact that the Ninevites being converted to Judaism, or a sect of Judaism, that ended up saving the Israelites. Now, but you say it ended up being great for the Jewish people, good for Jewish people, it saved them. So then you say, okay, you're stretching it a little bit. In a minute, I'm hopefully going to explain why that is not so.